So I'm often going on about how Genesis 1 and Genesis 2 are not separate. Always I am going on about how the narrative in Genesis 2 is the correction to the narrative in Genesis 1. I'm always saying this, and I have in past episodes, and I just figured now would be the time because our previous meeting together sort of is pushing us towards this direction, which is another fascinating conversation or dialogue to have, because once that is seen, how that transition from Genesis 1 to Genesis 2 takes place, well, then a whole lot can come into the fold and into the picture of the ideal situation that the mind within the scriptures would have our mind acknowledge. So what I want to focus on is from out of the dust of the ground. That's how Adam was formed, from out of the dust of the ground. Now, I want to make mention of the Genesis chapter 1, the first two verses, how the creation actually begins. The creation actually begins in chaos. The creation begins in chaos. There is an earth that is void and all this other stuff that then trickles down to the reformulation, and then to the repopulation, and to the regeneration of mankind for that specific world or realm that's being created. Genesis 2 kicks in, and Genesis 2 is a creation of its own, with animals of its own, with male of his own. But it's a different kind of creation, yet similar situation, because the landscape therein is also a bit void when you enter into that. Now, you look at Jeremiah 42:23. The same language used in Jeremiah 42:23 is the same language used in Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2. Jeremiah 4:23 says, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. This is the same language. This is the same language from Genesis chapter 1 and verse 2. Same language. But in Jeremiah chapter 4, we actually understand the earth that the prophet is writing about. Jeremiah 4:23 says, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. What is this earth? Jeremiah 4 and verse 10, verses prior. Jeremiah 4 and verse 10 reads, Then said I, Lord God, surely thou hast greatly deceived this people and Jerusalem, saying, You shall have peace, whereas the sword reacheth unto the soul. The earth that was made void is Jerusalem. The earth that was made void is Jerusalem. Genesis chapter 1, verses 2, having the same language of Jeremiah 4:23, this lets us know that the entire scope of Genesis chapter 1 is not alluding to a literal creation, because what is without void, without form, is not a literal earth, but is the earth of a particular Jerusalem. That's Genesis 1, verse 2. And that's the frame that the author of the book of Genesis, that the mind inspiring the Bible wants the individual going through the Bible to know, is that when they jump into Genesis 1, it's really not about a literal creation. It's about a workmanship for a recreating of a Jerusalem. So, and as we go along, you're going to see why that's important concerning what goes on in Genesis chapter 2. Genesis 1, I'm saying all of this because creation does not take place without chaos. Creation does not take place without bringing something from out of nothing. If this is the state of creation in Genesis 1, and you're entering into Genesis 2 and you're seeing a state of creation, well, then we have to, and it is fair to assume, and also to conclude, based off of how the author of Genesis 1 is treating the situation, that the context of Genesis 2 is the same. And that just as the without form and without void is going on in Genesis 1, well, that's the same situation, because creation only takes place from chaos and from nothing. according to the mind doing the creation within the scriptures.